Hey guys, we're going to take a look at our next part of multiplying complex numbers. But before we get into the multiplication, we got to talk about what happens when we multiply the letter I in our complex number. Now, if we were in class, probably would have gone over how these numbers come about and how this works. But just for now, these are going to be the powers that you might come up with in the problem. So you just got to understand that anything raised to the 0 power would be 1, which you already know that. Anything raised to the first power is obviously itself. Now, I squared equals -1. If you remember back from day 1, that the square root of -1 was always equal to I. Well, if I actually simplify that, meaning if I square both sides, my square roots cancel, so I'm left with -1 equals I squared. So that's where that comes from. And then if for some reason you had I squared times I know that's I to the third, this would just become -I. Now, again, I'm not going to go over where that comes from. If you do want to know, you can always reach out to me and we can go over it. But for now, I need you to have these values memorized. If you need to, put them on like a little cheat sheet. If we were in class, I would have had you make a vocab card with those. So let's move on to the actual problems. All right, so multiplication of complex numbers. So these are your steps. Step 1 is you're going to simplify any radical. Step 2, you're going to multiply the coefficients. And remember, since we're multiplying, we always add our exponents. And step 3, it would be simplifying. So you're going to be looking to combine any like terms and then simplify any of those powers of I. So this right here is just referring to these up here. All right, so if I look at example number 1, 2I times 5I, well, that's really 10, because 2 times 5 is 10. And when you multiply your i's, it means you're adding your exponents. So it becomes I squared. So to simplify, I know that I squared is really the same thing as -1. So it's 10 times -1. So my final answer is -10. All right, same thing. So for number 2, I'm going to simplify these radicals. So the square root of -49 is the same thing as 7I, which we learned about the last couple videos. Sorry about that. And the square root of -16 is the same thing as 4I. So if I multiply those together, 7 and 4 gets me 28. I times I is I squared. Now remember, I squared is the same thing as -1. So that's 28 times -1. So my final answer is -28. Pretty easy, right? Not too bad. All right, so let's take a look at this one. Square root of -3. That is not a perfect square. So I can actually break that down into the square root of -1 and the square root of 3. Same thing with square root of -7. Not a perfect square, so I can break that down into that. So if I simplify this, square root of -1 is I times radical 3 times I radical 21. Okay. Made a mistake there. I don't know where 21 came from. The square root of 7. So if I multiply, if I do I times I, that gets me I squared. And if I multiply my radicals, that gets me the square root of 21. Oops, I squared. Now the square root of 21 can't be broken down into a perfect square. However, I squared can be simplified to -1 times 21. So my final answer is just negative on the outside 21. Why don't you pause the video, give number 4 a try by yourself, and then play it again, see how you did. All right, so if I go through and I simplify my radicals. So square root of -6, not a perfect square. So I'm left with 6 times square root of -1 times 6, 2/3 times, and I'm gonna split up the square root of -6 into square root of -1 and 6. So I get 6 times I radical 6. Then I got 2/3 I radical 6. And just again, where that I is coming from is that the square root of -1 is I. That's where that's coming from. All right, so if I multiply my coefficients, so that means I'm going to multiply my 6 and my 2/3. So 6 times 2/3 gets me 4. I times I gets me I squared. And then square root of 6 times the square root of 6 is the square root of 36. Now if I look to simplify this, so I'm going to keep the 4. Now like we said, I squared, and I'm just getting this from up here. I squared is -1. Square root of 36, well, I know that is a nice number. So 4 times 1 is -4. -4 times 6 gets me final answer of -24. Not too bad, right? All right, so let's do a couple more complex ones. All right, so I'm going to be looking at these. And number 5 looks an awful lot like something that looks like this. So I know if I were to simplify it, I would distribute. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to distribute -4 and 3. So this gets me -12i. Then I'm going to distribute this here. Just be careful of your signs. A negative times a negative is +20. But then be careful, I times I is I squared. So now I can go through, and it looks like the only thing I can simplify is this I squared. So that's this is just as a reminder. So I get -12i plus 20 times -1, which gets me -12i minus 20. Now, if we were to write it in simplified form, this is completely okay. I'll take credit for this, but that's not in a plus or minus bi form. So really, -20 minus 12i would be the correct form. Again, if you left it like this, I'll take credit for it. All right, number 6. This one kind of looks pretty similar to something like this. And again, we would do our double distributive property. Now, before we do that, I'm actually going to simplify my radicals. So what I really have is 3 plus 2i times 1 minus 4i. Okay. Now I'm going to go through and do my double distributive property. So I'm going to do 3 times 1. Then I'm going to do 3 times -4i. And then I'm going to go through and multiply this by that and this by that. Okay? So 3 times 1 gets me 3 minus 12i plus 2i minus 8i squared. Because in this last one, we have I times I. Now again, just like before, you can combine your like terms. So I get 3 minus 10i minus 8, and then I'm also going to simplify I squared. I know that I squared is -1. So really, this is the same thing as 3 minus 10i. Now a -8 times a -1 is a +8. So that means my final answer becomes, well, 3 plus 8, 11 minus 10i. All right, run through a couple more examples. All right, anytime you have something squared, this is the same thing as saying 3 minus 2i times 3 minus 2i. And then this problem is very similar to what we did up here with our double distributive property. So I'm going to distribute these and get 9 minus 6i. Distribute these and get minus 6i plus 4i squared. Combine your like terms in the center. So I get 9 minus 12i plus 4 times, and again, I now know that I squared is equal to -1. So I get 9 minus 12i. 4 times a -1 is a -4. Just watch out for your signs. So my final answer is 5 minus 12i. All right, so why don't you pause the video and attempt questions 8, 9, and 10 by yourself, and then go ahead and play the video and see how you did. So gives me 25 minus 35i plus 35i minus 49i squared. Now when I combine these actually cancel out. So I'm left with 25 minus 49 times -1. So I squared becomes -1. So really my final answer is 25 plus 49, which happens to be 74. All right, number 9. Because of these right here, I gotta simplify my radicals first. That was in step number 1. So really I have 8 plus 5i times 2 plus I. So if I go through and do my double distributive property, I get 16 plus 8i plus 10i plus 5i squared. I'm going to combine my like terms. So I get 16 plus 18i plus 5 times -1. That's kind of the new thing for today. So I'm left with 16 plus 18i minus 5. 16 minus 5, so my final answer will be 11 plus 18i. And the last one. So it looks pretty easy. So if I go through and multiply, it gets me 15 plus 5i minus 3i. So a negative times a positive is negative, and then I squared. So if I combine my like terms, I get 15 plus 2i minus I squared, which is a -1, which is 15 plus 2i. A negative times a negative is really a +1, so my final answer is 16 plus 2i. Any questions? If you're still confused on this before you attempt the quizzes classwork, either meet me during our office hours, which I posted on the classroom, or reach out to me through email. You can set up a specific time during the week.